The morning of June 19th, 1944, Western Philippine Sea. Lieutenant Commander Zenji Abe peers through his binoculars from the bridge of the destroyer Shiratsuyu. His hands tremble slightly, not from fear, but from what he's seeing. American carriers, everywhere. Their grey hulls stretch across the horizon like a wall of steel. He counts them. 6, 7, 8. No, wait. 9 carriers in visual range. Behind them, more masts. The radio operators below deck are going mad trying to catalogue the contacts. Task Force 58, they're calling it. The Americans' Fast Carrier Task Force. Abe has read the intelligence briefings. He knows what headquarters in Tokyo believes. The Americans have perhaps 20 carriers operational in the entire Pacific, maybe 25 at most. Japan's naval intelligence has been tracking them meticulously since Midway. Every carrier has a name. Every name has a file. But this morning, in the waters off Saipan, Lieutenant Commander Abe is looking at nearly half the entire American carrier force in one place. It seems impossible. It seems like exactly what a desperate empire needs to see proof that if Japan can win here, win today, the war might still be salvageable. What he doesn't know, what almost no one in the Imperial Japanese Navy knows, is that he's looking at ghosts. Task Force 58 is real enough. The carriers are steel and rivets and aircraft. But the numbers Tokyo believes don't exist. The intelligence folders in the filing cabinets back in Japan describe a fleet that is a phantom. The Americans don't have 20 carriers. They don't have 25. And Task Force 58 isn't half their strength. It's barely a third. Because by the summer of 1944, through a perfect storm of deception, rapid construction, bureaucratic confusion, and Japan's own desperate need to believe their enemy was weaker than he was, Japanese naval intelligence had concluded something extraordinary. The United States Navy possessed more than 80 aircraft carriers. The actual number was 27. How does an entire empire, with one of the world's most sophisticated naval intelligence services, make an error of this magnitude? How do you see ghosts when you're looking at reality? And what does it do to your strategy, your morale, your very ability to fight, when every battle report seems to confirm that the Americans have more carriers than you ever imagined possible? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This is a story about the fog of war, but it's also a story about something more dangerous than fog, the kind of intelligence failure that comes not from lack of information, but from having too much of it, from seeing patterns where none exist, from counting the same ship twice, 3 times, 5 times, because you can't quite believe how fast your enemy is building them. The Japanese called it Kokubokan, the phantom carrier problem. American naval planners called it Operation Intermittent. Neither side fully understood it until after the war. But it shaped every major naval battle, from 1943 onward. To understand how Japan lost count, we have to go back before the phantoms, back to when the numbers were small enough to track. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. When Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's 6 carriers launched their strike against the American Pacific Fleet, Japanese naval intelligence knew exactly what they were facing. The United States had 7 aircraft carriers total. 3 were deployed to the Pacific: Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga. The other 4, Ranger, Wasp, Yorktown, and Hornet, were split between the Atlantic and various duties. 7 carriers. Japan had 11. The mathematics were clear. Lieutenant Commander Nakajima Tadashi ran the carrier tracking desk at the Naval General Staff Headquarters in Tokyo. His job was simple: know where every American flat top was, what condition it was in, and when it would be combat ready. In late 1941, this was possible. 7 ships, 7 folders, 7 pins on a map. Nakajima kept meticulous records. Each carrier had a dossier: tonnage, air wing composition, last known location, commanding officer, task force assignment. When Enterprise and Lexington were at sea during the Pearl Harbor attack, he knew it. When Saratoga took a torpedo from submarine I-6 in January 1942 and limped back to Puget Sound for repairs, he logged it. The numbers stayed manageable through those first months. In the Coral Sea in May of 1942, the Americans lost Lexington. At Midway in June, they lost Yorktown. Wasp went down off Guadalcanal in September. Hornet followed in October. By the end of 1942, the United States had lost 4 carriers. That left 3 of the original 7 operational: Enterprise, Saratoga, and Ranger. Nakajima's map looked almost empty. This should have been Japan's moment. The American carrier force was crippled, but the intelligence began getting complicated. Because even as the old carriers died, new names started appearing in intercepts. Essex, commissioned December 31st, 1942, a monster, 872 feet long, displacing over 27,000 tons when fully loaded, carrying 90 aircraft more than Shokaku or Zuikaku, Japan's best. This wasn't a replacement, this was an evolution. Then in January of 1943, Yorktown, not a Yorktown, the Yorktown, same name as the carrier sunk at Midway 7 months earlier. Nakajima stared at the intelligence report. Was this an error? A deception? Had the Americans raised the old Yorktown somehow? No. This was CV-10, a new hull number. The Americans had taken the name from a dead ship and given it to a new one. It was simultaneously practical and unsettling. From an intelligence perspective, it was madness. Now, every mention of Yorktown in radio intercepts had to be cross-referenced, Old Yorktown or New Yorktown. How do you track a ghost? In February, Lexington, CV-16. Another resurrection. The carrier sunk at Coral Sea, now sailed again. Or did she? No, this was a different ship, a new ship. But with the old name, with the old traditions, with an air wing that probably included veterans from the original Lexington. How do you tell them apart when listening to radio chatter? When a patrol plane reports sighting Lexington off Tarawa, which Lexington does it mean? The names became a nightmare of confusion. By mid-1943, Nakajima's neat filing system was breaking down. He had folders for ships that didn't exist anymore. He had new ship names that were old ship names. And then the Americans introduced something that would make everything infinitely worse. Task Force 58 and Task Force 38, the exact same carriers, operating under 2 completely different designations. The command structure was brilliant in its simplicity, devastating in its effect on Japanese intelligence. Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the 5th Fleet. When the carriers operated as part of the 5th Fleet, they became Task Force 58 under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. Admiral William Halsey commanded the 3rd Fleet. When the carriers operated as part of the 3rd Fleet, they became Task Force 38, also under Mitcher at first, later under Vice Admiral John McCain. But here's what made it brilliant. They were the same ships, the same exact carriers, the Essex, the Intrepid, the Bunker Hill, the Hornet, Lexington, the Yorktown. When Spruance's staff needed rest, they'd return to Pearl Harbor to plan the next operation. Halsey's staff would take command of the fleet at sea. The 5th Fleet would become the 3rd Fleet. Task Force 58 would become Task Force 38. The carriers wouldn't change. The escorts wouldn't change. Just the designation, just the name. Then, 6 months later, they'd switch back. American sailors joked that instead of changing the horses and keeping the drivers, they changed the drivers and kept the horses. It was hard on the horses, Admiral Halsey wrote later, but it was effective. Effective was an understatement. Japanese naval intelligence intercepts started reporting both Task Force 58 and Task Force 38 operating simultaneously. Radio direction finding placed TF-58 near the Marshall Islands. The next week, TF-38 hit Truk, then TF-58 appeared off the Marianas, while TF-38 struck the Philippines. Nakajima and his analysts faced a choice. Either the Americans could move their carriers at impossible speeds across thousands of miles of ocean, or they had twice as many carriers as previously believed. The doctrine said carriers couldn't be in two places at once. Logic said these must be different ships. The numbers started getting revised upward. But it wasn't just the task force designations, it was the sheer volume of construction. Every 2 months, starting in 1943, a new Essex-class carrier entered service. Not similar carriers, identical carriers, CV-11 through CV-21, then more, CV-31 through CV-40. The Americans were building them the way Japan built destroyers. The Essex-class program was unprecedented. 24 carriers ordered. 17 were commissioned before the war ended. The first one, USS Essex herself, took 20 months to build. By the time they'd worked out the process, they were completing one every 90 days. Newport News Shipbuilding, New York Naval Shipyard, Philadelphia Naval Yard, Norfolk Naval Yard, Bethlehem's Fall River Yard, 5 shipyards, all building to the exact same design. Standardized components, mass production techniques, the kind of industrial warfare that Japan's economy simply couldn't match, and Japanese intelligence knew it was happening. Submarine periscope photographs showed carriers under construction. Signal intelligence revealed contract awards, commissioning ceremonies, and shakedown cruises. Nakajima wasn't blind. He could see the Essex-class ships coming, but here's what he couldn't see. How many were actually operational at any given moment? A carrier under construction looks a lot like a carrier in refit. A carrier on shakedown looks a lot like a carrier heading to combat. When you're trying to track 15, 20, 25 ships that all look identical from submarine periscope photos, that all have similar radio signatures, that all operate with the same screening vessels, the numbers start to blur. And then there were the light carriers, the Independence class, 9 conversions from Cleveland-class light cruiser hulls. Smaller than the Essex ships, displacing about 11,000 tons versus 27,000, carrying only 33 aircraft instead of 90. But from a distance? From a submarine's periscope or from a reconnaissance plane at 15,000 feet? They looked like carriers. They counted as carriers. And finally, the escort carriers, the jeep carriers. The Kaiser shipyards were stamping them out like automobiles, CVEs. 50 of them were built by the end of 1943 alone, another 28 in 1944. They were slow. They were ungainly. They were designed for anti-submarine work and ground support, but they had flight decks. They launched aircraft. And when Japanese patrol planes reported carriers near convoy routes or invasion beaches, how were analysts supposed to know whether that meant a fast fleet carrier or a slow escort? The reports just said carriers. So the numbers grew, and kept growing. By January of 1944, when Nakajima compiled his annual assessment for the Naval General Staff, he had counted 53 American aircraft carriers. His superiors thought this was conservative. Radio intercepts suggested more. Reconnaissance reports kept finding new carriers. Prisoner interrogations mentioned ship names that weren't in the files. The intelligence analysts added a margin for ships they hadn't identified yet. Ships in transit, ships in refit, ships under construction that would commission soon. By summer of 1944, the estimate reached 65 carriers. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where Japanese pilots reported attacking at least 18 carriers, the number jumped again. Some analysts pushed it higher, 70, 75. One report suggested 80. The actual count? In June of 1944, the United States had 17 Essex-class fleet carriers commissioned, 9 Independence-class light carriers, plus Enterprise and Saratoga, the only pre-war survivors still operational. That's 27 fast carriers. Add the escort carriers if you want, but they were never used in fleet actions. They couldn't keep up. They were convoy escorts and amphibious support. Counting them in the battle line was like counting destroyer escorts as cruisers. It was categorically wrong. But Japanese intelligence was counting everything that floated and had a flight deck, every sighting, every intercept, every prisoner reports. The categories blurred, the numbers multiplied, and critically, no one in Tokyo wanted to believe the numbers were wrong. It's here that we have to understand the psychology of intelligence failure. Because this wasn't just a bureaucratic error. This was motivated reasoning on a national scale. By 1943, Japan was losing. The defensive perimeter was contracting. The shipping lanes were infested with American submarines. The industrial base was crumbling under bombing raids. Every report from the front was worse than the last. In that environment, inflated estimates of enemy strength became psychologically necessary. If the Americans had 60, 70, 80 carriers, then Japanese defeats weren't the result of incompetence or industrial weakness. They were the inevitable result of being overwhelmed by impossible numbers. Commander Masatake Okumiya, an air staff officer, wrote after the war, "We needed the Americans to be stronger than they were. Otherwise, we would have to confront the possibility that we were simply being outfought, outthought, and outproduced ship for ship. That truth was unbearable. The phantom carriers served a purpose. They explained away defeats. They justified defensive strategies. They made the loss of the Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, all of it seem like the result of facing overwhelming odds rather than systematic failure. And so the numbers stayed high. Even as American carriers took damage, Franklin crippled off Okinawa, Bunker Hill smashed by kamikazes, the official estimates never firstly dropped. Because admitting that there were fewer carriers meant admitting that Japan was being beaten by a smaller force than imagined. The intelligence apparatus had trapped itself. The more they saw American carriers, the more they believed there must be more they weren't seeing. Every patrol report confirmed the pattern. Every battle seemed to involve more carriers than the previous one. The numbers became self-reinforcing. Lieutenant Commander Nakajima's crisis came in March of 1945. He was sitting at his desk in the Naval General Staff building, reviewing intercept reports from the Philippines. Task Force 58, or was it 38 now? He'd lost track of which admiral had command this month had struck Okinawa. The action reports mentioned specific carriers: Essex, Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, Wasp, Enterprise, Franklin. Nakajima pulled that file. CV-13. Commissioned in January 1944. A long-hull Essex class. Nothing unusual. Except, he flipped through previous action reports. Franklin off Formosa in October. Franklin at Leyte Gulf. Franklin supported the Mindoro landings in December. Franklin in the South China Sea in January. Every major operation for 4 months. This carrier had been everywhere. Now, according to the latest reports, Franklin had been hit badly. 2 bombs through the flight deck. Fires throughout the ship, casualty reports suggesting hundreds dead. Some intercepts suggested she'd been abandoned. Others said she was limping toward Ulithi under her own power. Nakajima pulled another file. Bunker Hill, CV-17, commissioned in May of 1943. He traced her operational history. Similar story. Present at every major battle since the Gilberts. Then, in May of 1945, 2 kamikazes hit her. 390 dead. The ship ablaze from bow to stern. But here's what bothered him. Neither ship had been officially listed as sunk. Franklin showed up at Ulithi 3 weeks after the bombing. Bunker Hill reached Ulithi under her own power despite having been burning for hours. These ships, these Essex-class monsters, took damage that would have sent a Japanese carrier to the bottom, and they survived. Which meant the Americans weren't losing carriers as fast as Japan was sinking them, which meant the numbers weren't going down, which meant either American damage control was decades ahead of Japanese capabilities, or the Americans had so many carriers that losing 1 or 2 or 5 didn't matter. Nakajima chose to believe the latter. It was easier. But the truth that no one in Tokyo wanted to examine, was that American carriers were simply harder to sink. The Essex-class design included lessons from Yorktown, from Lexington, from every carrier lost in 1942. They had better compartmentalization, better fire suppression, better damage control training, and they had industrial support that meant repairs that would take Japan 6 months, could be done in 6 weeks. The phantom carriers existed partly because the real carriers wouldn't die. By April of 1945, Japanese naval intelligence was tracking 92 American aircraft carriers. 92. The files overflowed from Nakajima's desk. The map of the Pacific was covered in colored pins, each one representing a reported carrier sighting. The estimates broke down as follows: approximately 30 Essex-class fleet carriers, 20+ Independence-class light carriers, the rest, escort carriers, converted merchantmen, training carriers, and a category simply labeled Unidentified Fleet Carriers Pacific. That last category was the phantom carriers in their purest form, ships that intelligence believed must exist because the math didn't work otherwise. If Task Force 58 had 15 carriers and Task Force 38 had 15 carriers, and they operated simultaneously in different sectors, that meant 30 carriers just in the fast carrier force. Add the escort carriers screening convoys and supporting amphibious operations, those had to be counted separately. Add the carriers undergoing refit or transit. Add the carriers in training command, working up new air groups. The numbers demanded more ships than actually existed. But the alternative, that the Americans were moving the same ships faster than Japanese intelligence could track them, was too humiliating to accept. On April 6, 1945, Japan launched Operation Kikusui, the first mass kamikaze attack against American ships off Okinawa. Intelligence briefings told the pilots they'd face approximately 20 to 25 carriers in the Okinawa area. The pilots were told to prioritize carriers above all other targets. Sink the carriers, win the battle, simple mathematics. The pilots launched, they died by the hundreds, and they reported hitting carrier after carrier after carrier. Wasp hit, Essex hit, Intrepid hit, Enterprise hit, Franklin is already burning, Bunker Hill ablaze. The reports flooded back to Tokyo. We are sinking their carriers, we are winning, except the carriers kept appearing. Every day, a new carrier strikes. How many had to be hit before they stopped coming? The answer should have been obvious. You can only sink 27 ships 27 times. But when you believe there are 92 ships, every carrier that appears after you, think you've sunk it, must be a different carrier. It must be one of the phantoms, now revealed. The math creates its own evidence. Commander Okumiya, watching the kamikaze reports come in, finally understood what was happening. He wrote in his diary, "We have been fighting ghosts. The Americans show us the same ships again and again, and we count them as different vessels. We see Task Force 58 and believe it is separate from Task Force 38. We see carriers that refuse to sink and assume there must be more carriers behind them. We have created an enemy that exists more in our estimates than in reality." But by then, it was too late to matter. The actual number of American carriers was irrelevant. 27 was more than enough. The mechanics of the deception, if it could even be called deception, since much of it was unintentional, broke down into several key factors. First, the renaming problem. When Yorktown sank at Midway, the Americans commissioned a new carrier with the same name 7 months later. When Lexington went down at Coral Sea, she was replaced by a new Lexington 9 months later. Wasp, Hornet, all the old names came back. From an intelligence standpoint, this was devastating. Radio intercepts mentioning Yorktown could refer to either the sunken original or the new ship. Without hull numbers, which the Americans didn't broadcast in their communications, every carrier name became ambiguous. Second, the task force designation shuffle. Task Force 58 and Task Force 38, switching names every 6 months, while keeping the same ships, created the illusion of 2 separate carrier forces. Japanese analysts, trained to track organizations by designation, assumed different numbers meant different ships. The idea that the Americans would deliberately use the same ships under different names seemed unnecessarily confusing. Why would anyone do that? The answer, of course, was to confuse the enemy. But it seemed so obvious that Japanese intelligence convinced itself there must be another explanation. The Americans must have two separate fast carrier forces. That's the only logical conclusion. Third, the sheer speed of construction. The Essex-class program produced carriers faster than Japanese intelligence could verify their operational status. When you hear that CV-12 is commissioning, CV-13 is on sea trials, CV-14 is fitting out, and CV-16 is being launched all within a span of 6 months, it becomes impossible to track which ships are operational versus which are still working up. Japanese submarine reconnaissance could photograph carriers in port, but carriers in port might be in refit, or they might be preparing to deploy, or they might be loading supplies. Without actually tracking each carrier to sea, you couldn't know its status, so analysts assumed any carrier seen in port would be operational within weeks. The total operational count kept climbing. Fourth, the escort carrier confusion. CVEs looked like carriers from reconnaissance photos. They had flight decks. They launched aircraft. They operated with task forces. The fact that they were much slower and carried far fewer aircraft wasn't always apparent from intelligence reports. A patrol plane reporting 3 carriers off Saipan didn't specify whether these were Essex-class, Independence-class, or escort carriers. All 3 counted the same in the tally. By 1944, the United States had commissioned more than 70 escort carriers. Most were used for convoy escort in the Atlantic, anti-submarine patrol, or aircraft transport. They never fought in the major carrier battles. But Japanese intelligence counted them anyway because the reports said carriers and carriers were carriers. Fifth, the replacement crew problem. When Bunker Hill took 2 kamikaze hits and lost 390 men, she limped back to port. But her surviving air group personnel, pilots, aircrew, maintenance teams, they didn't all go home. Many transferred to other carriers. Pilots who'd flown from Bunker Hill suddenly showed up in radio intercepts, flying from Essex or Intrepid. Japanese intelligence, listening to these intercepts, heard Bunker Hill call signs from different carriers. The logical conclusion: these must be different ships. Maybe the Americans had multiple carriers named Bunker Hill, or maybe the air groups rotated between carriers so frequently that tracking ships by air group composition was useless. The truth was simpler. The Americans had more pilots than carriers, and they moved personnel around to keep every carrier at full strength. But this fluid crew assignment system made the already confusing carrier tracking even more chaotic. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The breaking point came in late July of 1945. Though almost nobody in Japan realized it at the time. American carrier strikes hit the Japanese home islands daily. The 3rd Fleet Task Force 38 under Halsey now operated with near impunity off the coast. 17 fast carriers, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. They struck airfields, factories, rail yards, and shipping. The Japanese air forces, already shattered at Okinawa, could offer almost no resistance. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff met to discuss defense plans. Captain Atsushi Oi, an operations officer, presented the intelligence assessment. Based on recent reconnaissance and intercept analysis, we estimate the enemy maintains approximately 35 to 40 fast carriers in the Pacific Theater, with 20 to 25 currently operational off our coast. Additionally, 60 to 70 escort carriers support their amphibious operations and convoy systems. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, listened without expression. Then he asked a question that nobody had thought to ask before. If they have so many carriers, where did they all come from? The room went silent. Toyoda continued, "We track their shipyards. We know their construction rates. The Americans laid down 30 Essex-class carriers. Even assuming they completed all of them, which they did not, that's 30 ships. Add their pre-war survivors, add the independence conversions. I count perhaps 35 fast carriers maximum, and that's including ships that must be in refit or training. Captain Orwee shuffled his papers. Sir, the reconnaissance reports show us the same ships repeatedly. Toyoda interrupted. Tell me, Captain, how many times have we sunk the Yorktown? How many times have we badly damaged the Intrepid? These ships appear in reports again and again because they are the same ships, operating continuously. We have been counting the same 25 carriers, 5, 6, 7 times over. Another officer spoke up. But the task force designations are meaningless, Toyoda said flatly. The Americans switched designations to confuse us. It worked. We confused ourselves into believing they have twice, 3 times their actual strength. The meeting ended inconclusively. The official estimates weren't revised. It was August of 1945. The atomic bombs were days away. Soviet entry into the war was imminent. Whether the Americans had 27 carriers or 92 carriers no longer mattered. Japan had already lost. After the surrender, American occupation forces examined captured Japanese intelligence files. What they found astonished them. Commander Carl S. Boyd, a U.S. Navy intelligence officer assigned to the occupation authority, spent weeks reviewing Nakajima's carrier tracking files. His report, filed in September of 1945, noted, Japanese naval intelligence maintained detailed records of American carrier construction, commissioning dates, and operational deployment. However, their actual count of operational carriers exceeded our own by a factor of 3 to 1. This overestimate appears to have resulted from several systematic errors. Misidentification of escort carriers as fleet carriers, double counting of carriers operating under different task force designations, failure to recognize carrier renaming conventions, and a tendency to assume damaged carriers were replaced rather than repaired. Boyd's report noted something else. The overestimation wasn't harmless. It had strategic consequences. Japanese naval doctrine in the later war years emphasized avoiding decisive battle. The thinking went, if the Americans have 80 carriers and Japan has 4, then any fleet engagement will be catastrophic. Better to husband resources, fight defensively, preserve strength for the final battle defending the home islands. This defensive mindset shaped everything from the Battle of the Philippine Sea to the Kamikaze campaign. Japanese commanders consistently refused to take risks because they believed they faced overwhelming numerical superiority. They weren't wrong about being outnumbered, but they were outnumbered 2 to 1, not 4 to 1 or 5 to 1. The difference mattered. At the Philippine Sea, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded 9 carriers against 15 American carriers. The numerical disadvantage was significant, but not insurmountable. With better tactics, better intelligence, better luck, Japan might have inflicted serious damage, but Ozawa, believing he faced 25 to 30 carriers, adopted an ultra-defensive strategy. He planned to fight at maximum range, relying on his aircraft's superior range to strike first and withdraw before American counterattacks could reach his carriers. The strategy failed. American submarines spotted his fleet early. American fighters, guided by radar, intercepted his strikes. American dive bombers found his carriers. The battle became the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a one-sided slaughter that destroyed Japan's carrier air power permanently. But the strategy itself came from the intelligence estimates. If Ozawa had known he faced 15 carriers instead of 30, would he have fought differently? Possibly. Probably. The Phantom carriers shaped the battle before the first bomb fell. The most sophisticated analysis of the Phantom carrier problem came from Commander Masatake Okumiya after the war. His book, Zero Fighter, included an appendix examining Japanese intelligence failures. Okumiya argued that the carrier overestimation resulted from what he called cascading confirmation bias. Each element of the intelligence system, signals, intercepts, reconnaissance reports, prisoner interrogations, submarine sightings operated independently. Each system developed its own carrier count. No central authority reconciled these counts against known American production capacity. When signals intelligence reported Task Force 58 and Task Force 38 operating simultaneously, they added both to the count. When reconnaissance planes sighted carriers off Okinawa, while other reports placed carriers near Formosa, both sightings were logged as separate ships. When prisoners mentioned serving on carriers that weren't in the official list, those carriers were added to the estimates. Nobody questioned whether these might be the same ships counted differently. Nobody asked whether the total made sense given American industrial capacity. The system was designed to count observations, not to verify them. Okumiya wrote, "We created an intelligence apparatus optimized for tracking what we expected to see. When the Americans exceeded our expectations not in number, but in operational tempo, in damage repair capability, in strategic mobility, our system interpreted this as evidence of more carriers, rather than evidence that our understanding of carrier operations was flawed," he concluded. The Americans did not have 80 carriers, but they operated 27 carriers with such intensity, such efficiency, that they achieved the operational effect of 80. They moved faster, fought harder, repaired quicker, and sustained operations longer than we believed possible. Our intelligence told us they must have more ships because we couldn't imagine one ship doing that much work. This was perhaps the most damning assessment of all. Japan didn't just count wrong. Japan failed to understand that American carriers operated under completely different paradigms, different logistics, different maintenance cycles, different crew rotation systems, different damage control. Everything is different. The Essex-class carriers could sustain combat operations for 60, 90, even 120 days without major resupply. Japanese carriers needed to return to port after 30 days. American carriers launched and recovered aircraft in conditions that would have grounded Japanese air operations. American carriers took battle damage that would have sunk Japanese carriers and kept fighting. The phantom carriers existed because the real carriers operated at a tempo that seemed impossible. So, Japan invented phantom ships to explain what their intelligence couldn't comprehend, that the Americans had built a better carrier, with better systems, crewed by better trained personnel, supported by better logistics, and deployed with better doctrine. 27 carriers operating like 80 meant Japan was fighting 80, regardless of how many hull numbers existed. Lieutenant Commander Nakajima survived the war. He was 41 years old on August 15, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. He walked out of the Naval General Staff building that morning and burned his carrier tracking files in a metal drum in the courtyard. Everything. 24 months of meticulous record-keeping. Dossiers on 92 carriers, real, phantom, and something in between. Radio intercept logs, reconnaissance photo analyses, prisoner interrogation summaries. All of it went into the fire. An American occupation officer stopped him. "What are you burning?" "Mistakes," Nakajima replied in English. "I am burning mistakes." The officer didn't press further. He assumed these were operational plans or classified orders. He had no idea he was watching the destruction of the most detailed documentation of one of the war's strangest intelligence failures. Nakajima would later work as a translator for the U.S. occupation authorities. He helped Commander Boyd compile the report on Japanese intelligence capabilities. He walked Boyd through the carrier tracking system, explaining how the estimates grew so inflated. He never mentioned that he'd been the primary analyst responsible for those estimates. In an interview conducted in 1968, 23 years after the war, Nakajima finally spoke openly about the phantom carriers. He was 74 years old, long retired, living in Yokohama. The interviewer asked, "When did you realize the Americans had fewer carriers than your estimates suggested?" Nakajima thought for a long moment. In my heart, I think I knew by early 1945. The numbers didn't make sense anymore, but I couldn't say it. To admit the estimates were wrong would be to admit that Japan wasn't losing to overwhelming force. We were simply being beaten. That admission was impossible while the war continued. Did the inflated estimates change anything? Did they affect Japanese strategy? Yes, Nakajima said. They made us cautious when we should have been bold. They made us defensive when we needed to attack. They justified doing nothing when we should have done anything. The phantom carriers paralyzed us. We saw ghosts and believed they were real. And while we feared the ghosts, the real carriers killed us. The final irony of the phantom carrier problem is that it contained a grain of truth. The United States did produce carriers at a rate Japan found incomprehensible. From December of 1941 to August of 1945, American shipyards launched 98 aircraft carriers, 17 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and 72 escort carriers. Japan, in the same period, commissioned 18 carriers of all types combined. Even accounting for different categories and different capabilities, the production disparity was staggering. Japan anticipated American industrial strength would be significant. They didn't anticipate it would be utterly overwhelming. And the Essex-class carriers that formed the core of the fast carrier task force were legitimately impressive. They displaced more than any Japanese carrier except Shinano, the converted Yamato-class battleship that sank on her maiden voyage. They carried more aircraft. They operated at a higher tempo. They absorbed damage that would have destroyed Japanese carriers. So when Japanese intelligence overestimated American carrier strength, they were making an error. But they were making an error in the right direction. They were trying to quantify something that was, in fact, beyond their frame of reference. The United States built a carrier force unlike anything that had existed in naval history, not just in numbers, but in capability, sustainability, and operational doctrine. Japan's intelligence services tried to understand this force using categories and assumptions derived from their own experience. It was like trying to measure a tsunami with a rain gauge. The instrument isn't wrong, exactly. It's just completely inadequate for the phenomenon being measured. By the time Japanese intelligence revised its estimates downward in the last weeks of the war, when it no longer mattered, the actual number of American carriers had become almost irrelevant. Whether Task Force 38 had 17 carriers or 35 carriers didn't change the fundamental reality. The United States controlled the Pacific, could strike anywhere it chose, and Japan had no way to stop it. The phantom carriers died with the empire they helped defeat. The real carriers sailed into Tokyo Bay in September of 1945 and accepted Japan's surrender. 27 ships, not 80, not 92, just 27, but they had enough. Today, naval historians studying the Pacific War sometimes cite the phantom carrier problem as a cautionary tale about intelligence analysis. It appears in staff, college curricula under various names: the compound error, the ghost fleet, the multiplication effect. The lesson is usually framed as follows. When facing an adversary who operates under different assumptions, different doctrines, and different capabilities, be careful about projecting your own limitations onto them. Don't assume they can't do something simply because you can't do it. And don't let your intelligence apparatus count observations without verifying those observations against ground truth. But there's another lesson, less frequently discussed. Sometimes your intelligence is telling you the truth, just not the truth you're listening for. Japanese naval intelligence was correct that American carrier operations represented a capability far beyond what Japan could match. They were correct that the fast carrier task force could strike anywhere in the Pacific with devastating effect. They were correct that American industrial production had created a naval force unlike anything previously seen. They were just wrong about the mechanism. The Americans didn't win by building 80 carriers. They won by building 27 carriers that operated like 80. By designing better ships, training better crews, developing better logistics, and executing better doctrine. The Phantom carriers were real. They just weren't ships. They were the manifestation of American industrial capacity, operational efficiency, and strategic flexibility. Japan counted ships when they should have been measuring capability. The numbers were wrong, but the conclusion was right. The Americans had more carrier power than Japan could overcome. In the end, that's what sank the empire. Not ghosts, not phantoms. Just 27 carriers that refused to stop fighting, refused to stay sunk, refused to operate within the constraints that limited their opponents. Japan invented extra carriers to explain why they were losing. The truth was simpler and more devastating. The real carriers were more than enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.